Section 23 of Gray's Anatomy Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 3, by Henry Gray. 1. The hypogastric artery. Arteria hypogastrica, internal iliac artery. The hypogastric artery supplies the walls and the viscera of the pelvis, the buttock, the generative organs, and the medial side of the thigh. It is a short, thick vessel, smaller than the external iliac, about 4 centimeters in length. It arises at the bifurcation of the common iliac, opposite the lumbosacral articulation, and passing downward to the upper margin of the greater sciatic foramen, divides into 2 large trunks, an anterior and a posterior. Relations. It is in relation in front with the ureter, behind with the internal iliac vein, the lumbosacral trunk, and the piriformis muscle, laterally near its origin with the external iliac vein which lies between it and the psoas major muscle, lower down with the obturator nerve. In the fetus the hypogastric artery is twice as large as the external iliac, and is the direct continuation of the common iliac. It descends along the side of the bladder and runs downward on the back of the anterior wall of the abdomen to the umbilicus, converging towards its fellow of the opposite side. Having passed through the umbilical opening, the 2 arteries, now termed umbilical, enter the umbilical cord, where they are coiled around the umbilical vein, and ultimately ramify in the placenta. At birth, when the placental circulation ceases, the pelvic portion only of the artery remains patent, and constitute the hypogastric and the first part of the superior vesical artery of the adult. The remainder of the vessel is converted into a solid fibrous cord, the lateral umbilical ligament, obliterated hypogastric artery, which extends from the pelvis to the umbilicus. Peculiarities as regards length. In 2/3 of a large number of cases, the length of the hypogastric varied between 2.25 and 3.4 centimeters. In the remaining third it was more frequently longer than shorter, the maximum length being about 7 centimeters, the minimum about 1 centimeter. The length of the common iliac, the hypogastric arteries be in inverse proportion to each other, the hypogastric artery being long when the common iliac is short, and vice versa. As regards its place of division. The place of division of the hypogastric varies between the upper margin of the sacrum and the upper border of the greater sciatic foramen. The right and left hypogastric arteries in a series of cases often differed in length, but neither seemed constantly to exceed the other. Collateral circulation. The circulation of the ligature of the hypogastric artery is carried on by the anastomosis of the uterine and ovarian arteries, of the vesical arteries of the 2 sides, of the hemorrhoidal branches of the hypogastric with those from the inferior mesenteric, of the obturator artery by means of its pubic branch, with the vessel of the opposite side, and with the inferior epigastric and medial femoral circumflex, of the circumflex and perforating branches of the profunda femoris, with the inferior gluteal, of the superior gluteal with the posterior branches of the lateral sacral arteries, of the iliolumbar with the last lumbar, of the lateral sacral with the middle sacral, and of the iliac circumflex with the iliolumbar and superior gluteal branches. The branches of the hypogastric artery are from the anterior trunk, superior vesical, middle vesical, inferior vesical, middle hemorrhoidal, obturator, internal padental, inferior gluteal. In the female, uterine, vaginal. From the posterior trunk, iliolumbar, lateral sacral, superior gluteal. The superior vesical artery, arteria vesicalis superior, supplies numerous branches to the upper part of the bladder. From one of these slender vessels, the artery of the ductus deferens takes origin and accompanies the duct in its course to the testis, where it anastomoses with the internal spermatic artery. Other branches supply the ureter. The first part of the superior vesical artery represents the terminal section of the pervious portion of the fatal hypogastric artery. The middle vesical artery, arteria vesicalis medialis, usually a branch of the superior, is distributed to the fundus of the bladder and the vesiculae seminales. The inferior vesical artery, artery vesicalis inferior frequently arises in common with the middle hemorrhoidal and is distributed to the fundus of the bladder, the prostate, and the vesiculae seminalis. The branches of the prostate communicate with the corresponding vessels of the opposite side. The middle hemorrhoidal artery, arteria hemorrhoidalis media, usually arises with the preceding vessel. It is distributed to the rectum, anastomosing with the inferior vesicle and with the superior and inferior hemorrhoidal arteries. It gives offsets to the vesiculae seminalis and prostate. The uterine artery, arteria uterina, springs from the anterior division of the hypogastric and runs medialward on the levator ani and toward the cervix uteri about 2 centimeters from the cervix. It crosses above and in front of the ureter, to which it supplies a small branch. Reaching the side of the uterus, it ascends in a tortuous manner between the 2 layers of the broad ligament to the junction of the uterine tube and uterus. It then runs lateralward toward the hilus of the ovary, and ends by joining the ovarian artery. It supplies branches to the cervix uteri and others which descend to the vagina. The latter anastomose with branches of the vaginal arteries, and form with them 2 median longitudinal vessels, the assigus arteries of the vagina, one of which runs down in front of the vagina and the other behind. It supplies numerous branches of the body of the uterus, and from its terminal portion twigs are distributed to the uterine tube and the round ligament of the uterus. The vaginal artery, arteria vaginalis, usually corresponds to the inferior vesicle in the male. It descends upon the vagina, supplying its mucous membrane, and sends branches to the bulb of the vestibule, the fundus of the bladder, and the contiguous part of the rectum. It assists in forming the assigus arteries of the vagina, and is frequently represented by 2 or 3 branches. The obturator artery, arteria obturatoria, passes forward and downward on the lateral wall of the pelvis, and to the upper part of the obturator foramen, and, escaping from the pelvic cavity through the obturator channel, it divides into an anterior and a posterior branch. In the pelvic cavity, this vessel is in relation laterally with the obturator fascia, medially with the ureter, ductus deferens, and peritoneum, while a little below it is the obturator nerve. Branches. Inside the pelvis, the obturator artery gives off the iliac branches to the iliac fossa, which supply the bone and the iliacus, and anastomose with the iliolumbar artery, a vesical branch which runs backward to supply the bladder, and a pubic branch, which is given off from the vessel just before it leaves the pelvic cavity. The pubic branch ascends upon the back of the pubis, communicating with the corresponding vessel of the opposite side and with the inferior epigastric artery. Outside the pelvis, the obturator artery divides at the upper margin of the obturator foramen into an anterior and a posterior branch, which encircle the foramen under the cover of the obturator externus. The anterior branch, which runs forward on the outer surface of the obturator membrane and then curves downward along the anterior margin of the foramen, distributes branches to the obturator externus, pectineus, adductores, and gracilis, and anastomoses with the posterior branch and with the medial femoral circumflex artery. The posterior branch follows the posterior margin of the foramen and turns downward on the inferior ramus of the ischium, where it anastomoses with the anterior branch. It gives twigs to the muscles attached to the ischial tuberosity and anastomoses with the inferior gluteal. It also supplies an articular branch which enters the hip joint through the acetabular notch, ramifies in the fat of the bottom at the acetabulum, and sends a twig along the ligamentum teres to the head of the femur. Peculiarities. The obturator artery sometimes arises from the main stem or from the posterior trunk of the hypogastric, or it may spring from the superior gluteal artery. Occasionally it arises from the external iliac. In about 2 out of every 7 cases, it springs from the inferior epigastric and descends almost vertically to the upper part of the obturator foramen. The artery in its course usually lies in contact with the external iliac vein, and on the lateral side of the femoral ring. In such cases, it would not be endangered in the operation for strangulated femoral hernia. Occasionally, however, it curves along the free margin of the lanucular ligament, and if in such circumstances a femoral hernia occurred, the vessel would almost completely encircle the neck of the hernial sac, and would be in great danger of being wounded if an operation were performed by strangulation. The internal prudental artery, arteria pudenta interna, internal pubic artery. is the smaller of the two terminal branches of the interior trunk of the hypogastric, and supplies the external organs of generation. Though the course of the artery is the same in the two sexes, the vessel is small